Jacob Jans here with the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. Welcome. I am really excited for today's talk with Dennis James Sweeney. If you're here, feel free to say hello in the chat where you are in the world. I'm in Toronto. We're expecting a snowstorm later this afternoon, and I may be helping a friend move actually during that. So that should be exciting. Hello in Sweden and Rhode Island and Virginia and UK, and hello in Oregon. Somebody's in Arrakis right now. Hello in Florida and Seattle and Golden, Colorado. Hello in Denmark. Hello, everybody. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Hello in Trinidad and Tobago and Los Angeles. Hello, everybody. Um, Good to see everybody's names and where you are in the world. Welcome. Really excited for today's talk. Yeah, we're just going to wait a minute so that everybody who's going to be here live will be here, and then we'll get started. So once again, feel free to say hello. A quick note, there will be slides today, but they will be sent to you after the talk along with the recording. So you don't have to worry too much about taking notes. And if there's links and references in the slides, you'll be getting those in your email inbox. So look for that. Yeah, so thank you again, everybody, for being here. Welcome. Hello and welcome. Let me just pull up my notes and then we will get started. Hello, writers. This is Jacob Jans with the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Dennis James Sweeney, who will be giving a talk on how to get published and love doing it, including practical strategies for getting published in a way that is meaningful and nurtures your writing life. This is part of our monthly lecture series where we host talks on the business of publishing and the craft of writing. Dennis James Sweeney is the author of the just published book, How to Submit, Getting Your Writing Published with Literary Magazines and Small Presses. If you find today's talk valuable, I very much encourage you to learn more by picking up a copy of his book, which should be widely available at online retailers. Dennis's first book, In the Antarctic Circle, won the Autumn House Rising Writer Prize and was a debut poetry book of 2021 in Poets and Writers. You're the Woods 2, his second book, was a small press distribution bestseller and a finalist for the Deborah Tall Lyric Essay Prize. Most recently, the Rolodex Happenings won the Stillhouse Press Novella Prize. Thank you, Dennis, for being here. Welcome. How are you?
Thank you so much. I'm doing well. It's good to hear you have a snowstorm coming. We have like 2 weeks of snowstorms, all just finally melting. The temperatures are rising here.
Yeah.
So
Similar here, but I guess they're going to add to the snow pile. Those who live in cold climates in the winter know what that's like. So, yeah, I'm excited to hear your talk. I think you have quite a lot of knowledge on this topic and like practical experience as well. So, I think this should be an educational experience for us all and one that I think will help a lot of writers.
I'm really excited to share this with you. Yeah, the conversation we were having before starting was also great to just get me excited about talking a little bit more about what it means to find community when we're publishing our writing and to do it in a way that makes us happy. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, as soon as you're ready, go ahead and load up your slideshow. And again, everybody will be getting a copy of the slides after the talk. So don't worry about taking notes. And yeah, looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jacob. And thank you all for being here. It's really delightful to see you all and to see the chat going. I'm really excited to talk with you today and hear some of your questions later on. Please feel free to ask anything along the way, and I'll do my best to answer it at the end. I was going to introduce myself, but Jacob did an awesome job. I'm the author of this book, How to Submit, Getting Your Writing Published with Literary Magazines and Small Presses. It's in the background of me right now. And it's literary magazines and small presses are a world that has really influenced my point of view around publishing. Because there's a lot of community that comes from small press and literary magazine publishing context, and that sense of community and that sense of connection has really driven who I am as a writer and the experiences that I've had with the writing world. So that's why I'm coming to you today with this presentation, which is about how to get published, but not just get published, how to get published and enjoy the process of it, right? To love the process of doing that. Often we can come to writing with this sense of inspiration and the sense of doing something that's really satisfying for our hearts, right? But when it comes time to get published, it becomes this more difficult, more dismal process. It can be a little bit draining on our energy, right? And of course, Authors Publish is here already, like helping you have a really good experience publishing and working toward that, right? And I want to help supplement that work by describing some strategies and techniques that y'all can do to work toward having a more enjoyable, inspiring, satisfying experience with your publishing lives, and then help that also allow you to get published more successfully too. Because I think when you're enjoying it and when you're loving the process, you can also be more successful in that process, whatever success is going to mean to you. My own experiences have come from, like I said, the small press and literary magazine world, but I'll talk a little bit about submitting to agents and things like that too, because I also have a literary agent now and I kind of understand how that system works and want to apply these techniques to that too. The things I'm going to ask you to think about in the course of this lecture are things that I'm going to return to, and they're going to be on the slideshow that I'll start in a moment. But I want you to ask yourself 3 questions when you're jumping into the process of trying to get published. The first thing is this process of publication going to inspire me? The second is the process of trying to get published going to feed my writing, and is it going to feed my creativity? And third, is the way that I go about trying to get published and publishing my work, is it going to make me feel like the writer I want to be, regardless of how quickly I achieve an acceptance? All right, so we're trying to get that energy back from our publication strategies. All right, the way I'm going to break this up is to give you both strategic guidelines, sort of like more general points that you can follow in your practices, and then also resources, like specific resources that are going to be links on the slideshow that you can click on and access, and those will make sure your process continues giving energy back to you. And I'll share the slides on and off. Sometimes I'll bring my face back on, but as Jacob said, you'll have access to the slides at the end of this presentation. And like I said, I'm really looking forward to your questions at the end, because this is a conversation. It shouldn't just be a one-way street from me. I'll tell you what I have to give, and then I want to hear what you have to say as well. So this little picture that shows my book here. And the first thing that I want to tell you is going to be 5 points that I'm going to focus on. Again, these sort of strategic points that also have some resources associated with them. But the first thing that I want you to think about when you're trying to figure out how to get good energy back from your publication process is building an authentic connection to the people and the places where you'll submit. Okay, so when we initially go into the process of researching where we're going to send our writing, it can feel like kind of a process that feels a little bit threatening or feels like something that we might be hesitant to do because we're seeing lists primarily based on prestige, right? Like how venues for submission are ranked. And so I provided some of the resources that rank literary magazines and small presses and later on agents, just so you can take a look at those later on if you want to. Here's some of the rank lists for literary magazines. And again, I won't talk through these because you'll have the opportunity to look at them later on. But here's some rank lists for small presses. And these often list these types of venues in terms of their prestige, or like how popular they are or how many people read them, things like that. It's really easy to get caught up in this kind of stuff when you're looking at places to submit. And if you move on from these sort of more hierarchical rankings of places where you might submit your writing, you can also find unranked lists, right? You can find lists like Duotrope, Chill Subs, Writers Market, and of course, Authors Publish, that will help you think more laterally about where you're submitting your writing, right? Instead of thinking about it exclusively based on prestige, it'll help you think about it in terms of how it's going to apply to your own writing and how closely it's going to fit the work that you're going to do. So again, here's some resources that provide you with a more lateral way of looking at the resources that you want to look at. But the way that I think about submitting your writing and developing a relationship with publication context most successfully is when you develop an authentic relationship with those contexts. So all those lists that I just showed you are really nice for starting out, but they don't have that joyful integrating of yourself with your own writing community that I want to sort of suggest that we take. So that kind of integration with the writing community is something that really helps you have a good time submitting your writing and being a part of that community, and it'll help you get published. So I'm also going to share a few strategies that are going to help you do that instead of just having this research-based relationship with publications, to have a real authentic relationship with publications that begins long before you even write the piece of writing that you want to submit. It's something that begins at the very beginning of the process. So, oops. So the way that I want to suggest for you to build an authentic connection with your publication contacts are a few different ways. All right, there's 3 different ways. The first that I want to suggest to do is to get involved as a reader. And again, this starts way before you even write a piece that you want to submit necessarily, right? You can read online literary magazines, buy books from a diversity of presses and represented by a variety of agents. You can go to online reading series or local reading series, researching authors you like, their agents, and their publishing histories. In general, I like to think about this as we're always reading, right? But if we're reading with an idea about who is publishing the writing that we're reading, then we have this much deeper sense of the context of what is influencing us and what matters to us. So instead of just reading a book and saying, that's nice, maybe I'll read more of that author, you can read a book and say, oh, I wonder what the press is that published this. And I wonder who the agent is that represented this author. And I wonder who else is represented by that agent. And then you can follow through the publication circumstances to other authors who have worked with those publication circumstances, et cetera. And so suddenly, even just in your reading life, you have a much more complex and embedded relationship to the literary community that's already influencing your writing. So getting involved as a reader is one really wonderful way of building an authentic connection and something that you can integrate with your life already as a reader. Another way is to contribute to literary community. So to kind of give your labor to folks who are doing the work of publishing and sharing writing. One way of doing that that's been really helpful for me is writing book reviews. So just taking books that have really meant a lot to you and entering the conversation and remarking on what you have to say about those books. People are always looking for book reviews. And it's a really nice genre in which you can break into the literary community without necessarily publishing your creative writing first. You can start by publishing reviews. Volunteering for a literary magazine or small press can be really helpful. Helping with a reading series is awesome. And then you can do things like you're doing today, participate in writing groups, workshops, and classes, right? And the more intimate, sometimes the better, because then you can have those close conversations with the people in the class and you can develop that writing community. Okay, again, these are going to help you have that sense of connection to the literary world so that when you come to the table with your writing, you're not going to feel like you're starting from the absolute beginning. You're already going to be embedded in those communities. And then, of course, you can connect online and in person. You can get on any of the social media sites that resonate for you, but you can also visit bookstores associated with small presses, for example, or attend literary festivals and conferences like AWP. These are all great possibilities for building that connection. And I want to talk about these types of connections, not just in a general sense, but in a specific sense with regard to my own publishing life, so that you get an idea of like one way that this might work, right? So I published this book called You're the Woods Too. It's a lyric essay book, but it's very experimental. It also has fiction and these lyric nonfiction forms and a little bit of poetry in there. And it's this book that I was really excited to publish with Essay Press because long before I even wrote the book, I had been reading Essay Press's books and coming to know the genre of nonfiction through them. So many, many years before I even wrote this book, I already had this kind of deep familiarity with that press. Over the years, I eventually went to AWP, the major writing conference, and eventually went to their table where they had all their books set up and the editor was actually standing there. And I had a chance to actually go talk to the editor of that press and say, oh, I love your books. I'm so excited about what they do and how they influence my own writing, et cetera, et cetera. And then it just so happened that a few years later, I had written a book that made sense for them to publish. And after a few tries submitting it to their contest several times, it eventually got published by them. But I think the process of getting published by them and having a really great experience publishing with them, because I've continued to have a relationship with that editor and continued to be in touch with them, the connection involved in that began way before I ended up submitting to that press. And so think about what's beginning long before you send out the work, right? Like what's already in process and what are you bringing to the table by the time that you get to the submission process. That can be a little bit more complicated when it comes to agents, because I find agents to be a little less directly accessible. Like they're not going to be standing behind a table at AWP selling books necessarily, but you can still have a readerly relationship with agents before you've actually gotten an agent, right? You can figure out who they represent, read their books. If you like one book they represented, read another book they've represented. And that can help you develop like a really deep knowledge of who they are in your the time leading up to being in contact with them. And then when the time comes that you do get a literary agent, if that's a path you decide to walk, you can also take the step of being really involved in the people who are also their clients, which is something that I've done. I was fortunate to have a wonderful literary agent, Reiko Davis, for this book, How to Submit. And ever since I signed with her, I had the opportunity to read some of the books that she's also represented and follow other authors that she represents on social media. And so even this publishing context can become a way that you access community. And it can be really rewarding and not just a business relationship. So I think continuing to think about things in terms of connection and not just a business relationship continues from a very long time before you submitting your writing to long after you're submitting your writing, right? And I find that really gives back to the feeling of having an inspiring experience when you're publishing your work. So that's the first point that I want to share with you. But the question is, how do you bring this sense of connection to your actual submission process, right? And one really important way to do that is to emphasize these connections that begin long before the process of submission in your cover letter or your query letter. So what I'll do in this section is share with you a couple different possibilities for how you can do that. The first thing that I'll do is provide like a cover letter template, especially for submitting to literary magazines and small presses, which is going to help you figure out how do I emphasize the connections that I already have with a publication in order to make it something that is not just I'm trying to get published and I'm trying to make sure that this person's going to put out my writing in their publication, but also a feeling of I'm actually having a conversation with this person and I'm connecting with the person on the other end of the transom through the cover letter that you're writing. Okay. So I won't talk through this in incredible detail, right? But I'll just give you the slides that you'll have later on that you can use as templates for your own work. And then I'll also point out the places where that sense of connection and being a part of the literary community can also happen through this physical document of your cover letter. So first of all, the salutation in a cover letter, obviously putting people's full names in there is a basic courtesy, but it's also a way of establishing connection. The most important thing, though, I think, is the introductory paragraph of your cover letter for a literary magazine or a small press. Later on, I'll talk about query letters, but right now we're talking about literary magazine and small press cover letters. And there's a few different ways that you can track and represent your connections that you have with people in these cover letters. One of them, and the most important one, is to track your pre-existing relationship with a publication venue. So if you're getting positive rejections from a venue, that is a wonderful thing. It's when you send your work and then somebody sends back a no answer, we can't publish this, but they say we really enjoyed this, we'd like to see more of your work. These are really important, and they're important to mention later on in the process of submitting so that they know that they had talked about your work before. And when you get these positive rejections, for me, it's actually this really enlivening part of the submission process. It's not just, oh, I got a positive rejection, maybe I'll get published next time. It's actually, hey, there's an editor out there who really cares about my work and is really excited about what I'm doing, and maybe they can support my writing in the future. And that's something that, for me, gives a lot of energy back. Another thing you can emphasize in that introductory paragraph is a personal relationship to a publication. So if you have met them before, or if you've been invited to submit, you can emphasize that. For example, I have met people at AWP who invited me to submit to their publication, and I can mention that in my cover letter. And there's also your writings or your relationship to the publication, right? So if you want to mention how much you've read of that publication, whether you've subscribed to it for many years or you just read one or two stories that you found really fascinating, that can be on one hand, a really great way of getting their attention and understanding for them that that their submission venue, what their publication is like. But for me, it can also be this life-giving thing where you're saying, hey, I'm really submitting to you because I care about your publication. I'm having a personal relationship with the submission. Whether it works out or not, I'm starting a conversation instead of just sending this thing blindly out there, okay? You don't always have to put these in a cover letter, but I find it can be a really helpful way of emphasizing like how you're connected and how you're trying to build community with that publication. You can also emphasize some of the background of what you're submitting in that initial paragraph, but that has a little bit less to do with this sense of like getting energy back from your writing, connecting with folks through it. Okay. And here are a few examples for you. Your bio is also a way of connecting with people and emphasizing how you are embedded already in the literary world. It's just a way of communicating, this is what I do in the literary world, and this is how I'm already connected to you pre-existingly, even before the submission happens, like I was talking about in the last point. I have a sign off here and a valediction just to give you the full length of the template for a cover letter. But I'll also mention if you're submitting to a small press that sometimes you want to go even more into your personal relationship to the press and how your book fits into that. All right. So it's not just word count, genre, and title. If you're submitting to a small press, you're asking for a really significant commitment from the people who are publishing the press. And if you do that, they want to know that there's a commitment on your end as well. So like I was talking about in that earlier example with Essay Press, for me to describe to them my relationship to what they had been doing might have a lot to do with whether they decide to publish my work. And it has a lot to do with my awareness of where I'm fitting into their work as well, which in the end gives me a lot of energy back for my writing, okay? And here's another point that's important for submitting to small presses is also to echo the tone of the press itself. So there are more casual venues like a chapbook micro press of people who are, hand assembling a hand-stitched chapbook in their living rooms with a few friends over a case of beer. That's a more casual venue. You want to sort of reflect their tone versus a larger indie press that might expect a more professional approach or a more professional tone. All right, so using all these things to sort of tap into what's already going on there and allow people to understand where you're connecting with them already. I also decided to share my query letter for how to submit this book that I've been talking about and promoting recently. It literally just came out Tuesday, so I'm thinking about it a lot, and I'm ongoingly appreciative of y'all celebrating that with me. And I'm sharing it because there's a lot of great resources around query letters and whole talks about it and things like that, so I won't go deeply into it because it's really an art. But I am sharing mine so that you see this really key sentence, which is the second sentence in the query letter. I share the basic details at the beginning. I'm seeking representation for how to submit. And the second sentence is, I thought this book might be a fit because of your work with Alan Gelb's craft books, in addition to your sales to small presses, as well as the large houses. Okay, so this was a moment when I felt like it was really important to set up what my relationship was to Reiko, my current agent's work. I had noticed that she had published craft books like this one before, but even more importantly to me, I wanted to find an agent who had an awareness and appreciation of what small presses could be for the literary magazine, small press, and publishing world. Okay, I wanted people to appreciate that these were really big part of the literary landscape. And so I did a lot of research into the agents that were doing that. She was one of them whom I submitted to. And that's been a really big part of me enjoying my publishing life and really loving what I'm doing because it's not just a business relationship. I know Reiko really appreciates the message that I'm trying to convey, and that's because of the research that I put into figuring out who is going to appreciate that message. So that's an example for you. Feel free to steal things from it or borrow things from it if they fit your book. Let's see. I had a personal story I wanted to share about that as well, because cover letters, they're this one document, right? But they come in the process of a much, much larger story. And I'll share a story of somebody who I met a long time ago at a literary festival. It was about 5 years ago. I went down to LSU in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and had the opportunity to give a talk to a large group of students there One of them was Ian Lockaby, who's this awesome poet. And we just started talking there and just kept in touch on social media and things like that over the years. And eventually he started this publication called Mercury Furs. And it was this amazing little publication of experimental poems that was doing exactly the kind of thing that my poems happened to be doing at the time. So 4 or 5 years after I met him, I submitted it to this publication. And it was almost more of like a community enterprise than a sense of, I want to get my work published, so where am I going to publish it, right? I was just so excited to see him putting together this work. And he eventually published it in Mercury Furs. And that was just a tiny part in the whole process. Eventually, he asked me to come read with him for the launch of his chapbook. And our relationship has continued from there. We continue to keep in touch and read each other's work. So again, the cover letter can just be a blip in a much longer relationship. And it's that whole relationship that can be so life-giving for your work. Another more simple thing you can think about with cover letters and how you're connecting with a specific journal. Here's another example from my own life, is I was trying to publish this essay called The Conjugations, which was really important to me. It meant a lot to me. And there was an issue of the Journal, which is Ohio State University's MFA programs, literary magazine, literary journal. And they had an Ohio Writers issue. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. And I was like, okay, that's me. I'm an Ohio writer. And it was something as simple as saying, I'm an Ohio writer. I'm going to submit to this issue. And I'm going to make a little note about how this particular essay is related to the geography of where I grew up. And it ended up getting selected. And later on, classes have read it and it got shared with other people. And it was just delightful to get to put that into the world. And it's particularly delightful to put it into the world in the context of somebody who really sees what I'm doing and sees who I am and where I'm from, and what that can mean to the work. So those are just a couple examples of how that can be a really longitudinal relationship or a one-time thing where you're connecting with the theme of a publication and what they're working on. So this one I find to be really essential, is creating an energizing space for your work toward publication, or in other words, making the process a welcoming home for yourself. For me, this has to do, for one thing, with building an offline space and schedule. Okay, finding a place where you can go toward your computer, toward your submission process, and not have it feel stressful. All right, this is going to make a huge difference in how the submission process feels to you. If you're doing it frantically at random times out of a sense of anxiety, which can often happen, it happens for me a lot with submitting too, that's going to make submitting feel one type of way. But like many of us set aside time for our writing, right? We might have a special hour in the morning or a block of time on the weekend where we have tea and we sit at a special spot and maybe we breathe for a little bit before we do our writing. If you do those same things for your submitting practice, it can really bring an energetic change to that submitting practice. So for different people, that means different things. Some of us, it might be drink tea, light a candle, say a prayer, a devotion in the name of your writing, right? Just a way of centering yourself and bringing yourself to the purpose of what you're doing with your submission practice. That can be one way to do it. Another way to do it is to have a submitting party with your friends. A submitting party is when you invite everybody over. We say, okay, on Friday from 6 to 7, we're all going to sit down and we'll have a beer or some guacamole, and we will all submit our work and talk a little bit about the process of submission. That can also be a way of setting aside that time and having a time and space for working toward publication. The most important part about this, I think, is that you're compartmentalizing your time and not letting the experience get too scattered. Okay, you're finding a place where you can sit down and do the work in the inspired, sort of satisfying space that you would also devote to your writing, bringing the same kind of energy to it. For me, that was always after my morning writing sessions. 1 or 2 days a week for the last several years, I would take about an hour after my writing session, after I'd already satisfied myself with my creative work. I would sit down, do some research, send out 1 or 2 or 3 submissions, and let that be this sort of special space that I set aside and enjoyed each week. And just having that enjoyment of the process can really give a lot back to your results as well, because you're bringing a good spirit to it, right? Another thing you can do is to journal about your submitting process, to have a space where you keep track. How's it going? How are you feeling about it, etc. Okay. And I'll discuss in a second a place where you can do that. Because it's not just offline, it's not just in the physical space you create in your life that you can create a place for doing submission practice that's going to be satisfying to you, but it's also in your online life, right? And for me, organizing your online life into a satisfying and non-stressful space has a huge amount to do with loving this process of submissions, and it helps you get organized, which helps you ultimately be more successful in the process. So for me, I like to organize things into 3 documents that compartmentalizes the entire process and make sure that you know exactly what you're going to be doing at any given time, and make sure you don't have things scattered around and aren't experiencing too much stress about it. So there's a lot of really great potential documents that you can use to keep track of active submissions. I've linked to several of them. One of my favorites is Shannon Mann's that was recently shared with another lecture like this one on Authors Publish. It's really wonderful, and it just helps you keep track in a nice Excel or Google Sheets spreadsheet of exactly what your submission has been and whether you got an acceptance or rejection or encouraging rejection. And having a system like that can actually be really enjoyable and really help you have a process that feels organized and feels satisfying, right? Because it's all right there in front of you. And then having a second document, I think, can also be really helpful, of aspirations and possibilities. So this isn't just keeping track of where you've submitted, but it's keeping track of where you'd like to submit and all the things you'd like to do with your writing. I've included some possibilities for what that can include, but I think one really important part about it is that you can use that as a kind of journal to talk about your submission practice. So as I was saying before, a lot of us, when we're doing our writing process, we want to keep track of how the writing is going each day, right? For me, after a 1-hour writing session, I'll often sit down and say, oh, it's not going well today. I'm so stressed about this, that, and the other thing. Or I had a great session today. This is going to be a great book, etc. Right? And that helps keep me grounded in the process. You can do the same thing for your submission practice. I'm feeling really discouraged. I got another rejection. Or I'm feeling really encouraged. I'm really on my way to getting multiple parts of this book published, or whatever. Those kinds of little journal entries can really do a lot to help you feel grounded in the process and help you keep track of what you're actually doing, right? As well as helping you set goals that are going to allow you to do the things you want in the future and keep track of those things. All right. So let it be fun. Put in little smiley faces, color the letters different colors. My acceptances are all green and my rejections are red. But I put things in all caps when I'm really excited about them, right? If you can find a way to make these documents and this otherwise rather boring or sort of rote organizational stuff, if you can find a way to make it fun, that's just going to bring so much more life to your process. And it's going to allow it to have that more satisfying feeling that writing also hopefully has for us. And thirdly, having cover letter template is really helpful too. I talked about in the cover letter in the last point, and I think it's really important just to have a little cover letter template where you can copy and paste your cover letter so that it's nice and easy to use. All right, so letting the process of waiting and hearing back fuel your writing is really, really important, I think, because waiting has so much to do with our lives as writers and lives trying to publish our writing. We can be waiting for years, right, to publish a thing, and that's totally normal and totally okay. So figuring out how to use that energy is really essential. I've got 3 ideas about how you can use the energy of waiting to help energize your writing, okay? So when you're waiting, you might have a lot of nervous energy. You might say, what's going to come next? Am I really going to be able to do this? Should I keep writing? What should I do while I'm waiting? My idea is to use that energy and either write in a new genre, right? Write something you haven't written before, or use a writing muscle that you haven't yet used. That can be really helpful. For example, after writing How to Submit, this book that I've just published, I had been writing in this really logistical way, this kind of prescriptive nonfiction way, which I really enjoyed for a couple of years, but I really needed to take a break from it. So as soon as I got it submitted and everything like that, it's like, I need to just write some really experimental poetry and some really weird imagistic fiction. And that's going to give me this big relief. And it felt like a rest, but it was still progress toward my writing life and toward my publishing life, because it was giving me something to do and it was helping me feel inspired and satisfied along the way. For others of us, it might be inspiring to throw yourself into research about publishing context. When I'm deep in the process of submission, sometimes it can be nice to actually use that energy to keep researching and keep trying to understand where I'm going to look. So instead of getting overwhelmed or discouraged, Say you're submitting to an agent, you can keep looking up the next tier of agents that you want to submit to and just spend really a lot of time checking out books from the library that they've represented, and going deep into the publisher's marketplace archives and just figuring out who's the person you want to submit to. Going deep into that research and just really owning that process can also be really enjoyable for some of us who have that more logistical mindset. Or it's completely fine to pause your writing and focus on building yourself back up, going for a run, or eating food that you love, or spending time with people you care about that you haven't been able to spend as much time with during the process of writing, right? All those things can really build you back up. The main thing is just going with the energy and trying to preserve your energy instead of draining it out while you're submitting your writing. Rejections are a really big part of this, I think. And I see them as not a discouragement of your writing, but I see them as like an inevitability, right? Everybody's going to get rejected hundreds of times. All my books have been rejected 40, 50, 60 times before they got accepted. And I feel really fortunate that they ultimately got accepted, and they never would have been if I hadn't kept at it, and kept reevaluating when I got rejections. So when you get a rejection, if you get 10 or 20, I would say keep submitting. You don't necessarily have to reevaluate your writing. But after you start to get to higher numbers like that, I think it can be a time when you have to step back and think about your writing. It doesn't mean you have to put the writing away that's getting rejected, but I think it's a really nice time to step back and think about, is this writing the stuff that I really want to hold on to? I'll give you two examples from my own life. So one of them is these early short stories that I was writing that were formally experimental, but they weren't about any subject matter that I really cared about. They just kind of like were funny and interesting and things that I wanted to experiment with, right? And I remember sending out these stories, getting, some positive rejections, but also a lot of regular rejections. And after a while thinking, why is this not working with people? I thought it was good, but I didn't really have the spirit to keep on hanging with it and keep on trying to publish those stories. And so over time, I just kind of let them go. And it hurt to let them go, right? It's hard to let go of your writing. But the great thing about it was it actually made space for me to invest myself in writing that I cared more about. So later on, I was writing these creative nonfiction essays about having inflammatory bowel disease. I have Crohn's/ulcerative colitis. And those essays, they also got rejected the same amount, just like everything does. But when those rejections came in, they just solidified my desire to keep publishing that work. So they made me realize this is really important to me and I'm going to pursue it no matter what. I'm going to work until this gets published because I have to share this message and I have to help tell the story about an under-discussed illness in my case. And getting those rejections helped me figure out that I just never wanted to quit trying to write about that and trying to publish about that. And it helped me realize that sometimes I had to go back to the drawing board or I had to write those things in different ways in order to communicate that message, right? But getting those rejections are an opportunity to reevaluate. And I think it's really okay to embrace that possibility. And finally, you don't have to wait for an acceptance to join the conversation. I've actually gone so far as to paste the exact same things that I had earlier in the slideshow here. You'll see it: getting involved as a reader and contributing to the literary community and connecting online and in person. I won't go through them all again, but I've listed them here as a way of reminding you that the waiting process doesn't have to be just waiting, right? It can actually be a moment of getting really actively involved. And that's really how it was for me as a writer. I've always been writing for a really long time, but it took me 7, 8 years to get my first book published, even though I've been sending out books for much longer than that. And the thing that really sustained me that whole time was the fact of getting super involved in the literary community. For me, this meant starting to write book reviews, just for random books that people would send me because venues are always looking for that. Then I got involved with this literary magazine, Entropy, which they kind of invited me to be an editor as a part of it. And so I was contributing my labor to this magazine and helping kind of organize that process. And then over time, I finally began to publish my work a little bit more, finally began to publish my writing. But all the time, those communities that I was already contributing to were sustaining me, even though I wasn't relying on the publications themselves to sustain me, right? There was already the work, there were already the people that I was connecting with. So I really want to emphasize, you don't have to wait for acceptance to join the conversation of being a part of the literary world. The last thing I'll say is that after acceptance, I would encourage you not to stress. Just enjoy the details and the deluge, right? Publishing isn't the exact same as writing. It's not the exact same type of satisfying. It's not the exact same type of inspiring, even though I'm trying to get us toward that point in this lecture here. But it can have some of the same benefits and it can have some of the same resonances in our own lives. So once acceptance happens, there's a few things you're going to have to do. One of them is editing. And editing can be stressful, right? You're working with an editor, sometimes a copy editor, to try to improve your work that you've already perfected, that you've already worked so hard on in order to get it accepted. And you can have two attitudes toward that. You can have an attitude of, this is really stressful. Why do I have to do this extra step before it gets published? Or you can remind yourself that the moment of editing that work, of connecting with it, is a moment of actually building a relationship with the people who are working with you. There are people who are invested in your work and they really care about these little details and they really want to have a conversation with you about your writing. And that very conversation is the exact type of thing that we're doing this writing for, I think, because we're all people who care about these tiny little details of language. And being able to focus on that with somebody is a real privilege and a real gift. And so if we can get some energy back from that and remind ourselves that it's like a thing that can fill us up, I think that feels really great. Also, promoting your writing can be all consuming. It's very stressful to try to promote your writing and try to make sure it's going to sell and do well in the world and things like that. But for me, it really helps if you engage in a mindset shift to thinking about it as part of the creative process, right? So you write your book or you write your essay or you write your poem, and it's a thing you're communicating to the world. But the way you share the poem, the way you share it with readers is also a creative process, right? And it helps you craft a message in the world. And so, for example, like this workshop is exactly that for me. It's an opportunity to talk about not just this book that I've written, but things around it, and to use that as the beginning of a conversation that we'll have in a minute here to talk about submitting, to talk about querying, and how we can make this process more life-giving for ourselves. So I think of this as like absolutely part of the writing process, absolutely part of the creative process, and we're all in it together doing that creative process together. So all the promoting, all the stuff that goes around books, that's also the thing. We're in the thing right now. And then finally, as you experience the reception to your published writing, as you have connections with people around it, it can be really tempting to be clicking on your Amazon sales ranking or looking at your book scan or seeing how many books you sell, or just trying to see how many people responded to your social media post about a particular piece that you published or something like that, right? It's easy to get into that mindset, and I get into that mindset a lot. But if you can focus on depth instead of breadth, it makes a really big difference. So recently, I got an Instagram message from somebody who I know just sort of vaguely associatively through the literary world. And they said, oh, wow, I just love the publicity you've been doing around how to submit, the things you've been saying about non-hierarchical thinking in publication and community mindset really resonate for me. And I'm glad you're sharing that message with the world. And I was like, oh, that feels so great to have somebody communicate something like that directly to me. And so when I can think more about those direct conversations, those direct communications, the depth of that interaction feels really important to me. And I can focus more on that than on the numbers or how many I sell or whatever. That's going to give me a lot of energy back, and it's going to help me come back to my writing with some more energy too. So we often think about our published writing careers as careers, right? This thing that has to do with our professional life. But I want to encourage you to think about the word life instead, right? Like you're publishing life instead of your publishing career. How do we make this a life? How do we make it something that's beautiful for us that we actually want to live in? And how do we make decisions that are going to help us get that energy back that we came to writing for in the first place? That's what I want to encourage you to think about. So again, these questions that I'll ask you to keep thinking about. Is this process of seeking publication going to inspire me every time you make a decision about publishing? Think about that. Is my submitting or querying practice going to feed my writing, my creativity? And finally, is my journey toward publication going to make me feel like the writer I want to be, regardless of how long acceptance takes? Okay, I want you to be the writer you want to be. I want you to have an inspiring process of seeking publication, one that echoes your desires as a writer. And I want you to go into that world of publishing with a feeling of doing the thing, doing the writing, doing the creative process the whole time. That's what I wish for all of us. And I have a couple additional resources here, just some stuff I've included on the slideshow. Okay, please feel free to view these later on. And of course, you're always welcome to buy the book if some of this stuff resonates with you. But I'll stop talking there and happy to talk about any questions you might have and just really appreciate y'all's attention and everybody who's here to listen.
Dennis, thank you for that. I really love what you're talking about in terms of building an authentic and meaningful connection, as opposed to I think what everyone who publishes or tries to publish a lot falls into, which is just like pushing your work out there, pushing it out there. You know what I mean? Like,
Totally.
but building those relationships and like thinking about how relationship can help you like in your own writing life as opposed to your own career. I think that's something that um is so meaningful and important.
Thanks so much, Jacob. I appreciate you reflecting that message. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm hoping to get across. We can love this, we can appreciate this. And even though there's that all that kind of magnetism in the world toward that more prestige focused or just sending it out feeling, yeah, we can actually take hold of this and make ourselves an active part of it, inspired part of it.
Yeah. I think in my own life, like the personal relationships and like the interactions have been so much more meaningful than having a piece of writing out in the world. Like it is the relationships that ultimately matter, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I agree. You realize that more and more. I think earlier in my writing life, it was all about the publications. How can I get these things next to my name? Because I wanted to prove myself. But, once I proved myself, I was like, I don't know. I guess there was nothing to
Yeah.
prove the whole time. I just want to have a good relationship with people, have a
Yeah.
good life. Yeah,
I think that a lot of that tension comes from like you put so much work into a piece of writing, and then how do you make that work meaningful? You know what I mean? Like,
totally.
but I think that work becomes meaningful through like the relationships that it can help cultivate.
Yeah, one of my favorite moments that I talk a little bit about in the book is when I was reading one of my first essays about having IBD to like a room full of people. It was about 20 people, and I
Yeah.
just stood there, read it to them. And I was really like kind of nervous because it's very vulnerable work. And then afterward, like almost every single person in the room came up to me and like had a conversation with me about it. And I was like, oh my God, wow, this is exactly what I wanted, right? Sure, it got published. Sure, we have, these things we can put next to my name about it. But the most important thing is like having these conversations with people in the room and like developing those relationships from it.
Yeah. I actually have IBD as well, so I know how vulnerable like sharing the personal information can make you feel, but it also like vulnerability brings you closer to others, right?
Totally.
Uh,
Yeah.
so we have a lot of questions. Let's get to some of them. We have a question from Nate Boyd, who asks, "How does submitting your first book look different than when you have multiple books?"
Mm. That's a great question. Yeah, thank you, Nate. I think it depends which kind of venue you're going for. If you're going for small presses, I think one of the challenges can be that there are a lot of first book contests. And so you probably have more places that you can actually submit because people want to publish the first book from a writer, right? And they're really excited about that. And then once it's your second or third book, they're like, all right, you're already established. We're not really adding to the conversation as much here. But then you have the added benefit of having a little bit more credibility to your name because you have a book published. And you might have the opportunity to work with the publisher that had already published your book, right? So there's some pros and cons depending on which thing you're looking at. If it's working with an agent, I think it really depends. There can be a real prioritization of first books in the literary agent kind of big five publishing world, and it's good to emphasize that you'd be a debut author in your query
Hmm.
letter if you're going to be. But I don't think it's a big strike against you necessarily if you aren't a debut author, right? If you publish books with small presses, for example, like in my case, I have 3 other books before this book, How to Submit. And I think that added to my case, right? It was a way of saying, hey, I have like credibility or like relationships in this community and I'm qualified to write this other book about it, right? So I think it depends where you're going, but yeah, it's always a good thing whether you're submitting a first book or like not a first book. There is a bright side to either way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, we have a few people asking this question about having a platform or an existing audience or success. Is that something that's important when submitting to literary journals or small presses?
Yeah, the platform question. I think it's not actually that important when you're submitting to literary magazines and small presses. That's one of the reasons why I love literary magazines and small presses. They sometimes don't care how many copies of your book they're going to sell, right? Because they're either getting funded. We were talking about how small presses are funded before this conversation, and they're either getting funded partially by the government or by donations, or just out of the pocket of the person who's running them, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes by universities. And so they don't necessarily have to sell a ton of copies to remain semi-sustainable. So they can take a lot of risks, right? And those risks include publishing writers who have really exciting writing but don't have a platform. Larger publishers like Bib 5 publishers and people you'd approach with a literary agent usually are more interested in a platform because they need to guarantee a certain amount of sales in order to make the whole thing worthwhile. But I do think small presses and lit mags, one great thing is they don't require that platform. And even with the big five, I just feel like it's the same logic that I'm using in this presentation, which is if you love doing it, if it's going to give you energy, do it. If it's going to drain you and make you feel awful, just don't do it,
Yeah.
no matter what, right? It's never worth it if it's going to make you miserable. So, in my own case, I found like Substack, for example, I found out, oh, that's a thing that actually gives me energy to post something every 2 weeks on there. And so, I'll do that and that'll be my platform. But everything else, I'm like, no, it makes me miserable. Not going to do it. So I support you fully in not doing things if they're not going to work for you.
Yeah. And just based on my own experience, editors, agents, literary journal publishers, they're mostly just interested in good writing.
Totally.
Like that really is their number one priority. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think a platform can help sell a book that's maybe not as well written, but I think yeah, but if you got an amazing book, Jacob is right. Like that's the number one thing. That's really all you need.
Um, do you have thoughts on submission fees and especially contests or like first book contests and like paying fees in general when submitting?
It's such a great question and a really it's a hot question, right?
Yeah.
Because there's I spent 3, 4, 5 years on entropy interviewing small presses, and everybody had a different take on this, right? Some presses were like, we're never gonna charge submission fees. It's ridiculous to ask writers to pay for us to read their writing. And I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And then some people were like, we definitely charge submission fees because otherwise we wouldn't exist and we wouldn't have enough money to do what we're doing. And I said, oh, that's pretty reasonable too, right?
Hmm.
I think in an ideal world, yeah, we wouldn't be paying submission fees to submit our writing. And in that ideal world, people would have an infinite amount of resources to run their publishing endeavors, and they wouldn't have to source it out to writers. The resources would just be there, right? That requires like a lot of change, like governmental change, like economic change, whole lot of changes that aren't going to happen. So I think sometimes it's a little bit difficult to expect uh, already underfunded organizations to like do that work of not charging money, because actually charging money for submissions allows people who aren't already wealthy to run a publishing enterprise, right? In order to
Yeah.
not charge submissions, you kind of limit the amount of people who can run a press or a magazine. So I understand why they're in there. That said, sometimes it can be borderline predatory if people are charging huge submission fees and giving very little output on the other end for it. And I think there are discussions out there about certain venues that do that. But I think at the end of the day, it is up to you whether to submit to those venues. And for me, it's worth it if I'm submitting to a book contest, for example, because the payoff of that, like they're expensive, 20, 30, $40, but the payoff is huge because you get a book published. For me, submitting to contests with literary magazines, not a great payoff. You get published also, just the way folks who submitted through regular submissions would get published, but you pay a lot more for it. And maybe you get a credit next to your name, but for me, that's not the number one thing. So that's how I make the decision. But I fully recognize the complexity of the issue. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to like be hard line about it,
Yeah.
but you're right, there are many different ways of thinking about it that some of those arguments, they're legitimate arguments, whether or not you agree with them.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
It's a good way
And
to put
like
it.
I know Authors Publish, we're one of the few publication like services for writers that we don't list any opportunity with submission fees.
Yeah.
And that is like something I think is really important because on the writer's side of things, like you don't want to limit the opportunities in terms of who can actually submit their work. Like even a nominal submission fee of less than $1, like just access to banking in certain parts of the world isn't there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's really important. I really love that y'all take a stand about it. I feel like I have to kind of hold both sides and understand where folks are coming from to sort of represent the possibilities so y'all can make a
mhm,
choice. But I really love that you take a stand on it because the more people take a stand on it, the more people will develop other funding sources and have
yeah,
to figure out how to do it. Yeah.
yeah. Could be a long conversation.
Yeah, for real.
So do you have any thoughts on submitting a synopsis with a novel? Is that something you have much experience with?
Yeah, I think I don't have a huge amount of experience with it, to be honest, a little bit, but I do have some thoughts about how to approach it. It definitely depends on the venue. So if you're submitting, to an agent, if you're doing a query letter, like a significant like hook and then synopsis is a really important part of that. And you can find people who will tell you how to do that. And then when you're submitting to small presses, I think there's actually like a really big variation. If you're submitting to
Mhm.
like the professional small press, like Coffee House or Grey Wolf, if they happen to be open for submissions, I think giving them a really good synopsis and a way that they can kind of pitch your book and see what's going on is going to help because they're more of a business than a lot of small presses.
Yeah.
But if you're submitting to like this guy, who publishes this tiny small press and puts out like one book a year, it might be more important to be like, this book is totally nuts. Like it has this thing and that thing, and you're going to love it because it does this thing and that thing that you're really excited about. Right. And then it's going to be this more connective thing that doesn't feel like overly professionalized to them. So I think it's really, like I said a little bit earlier, about reflecting the tone of the press and what they might potentially want, which varies so much between small presses. It's kind of like a case by case basis, I think.
Something you said there, which brings up an idea which I think you have, but you haven't like talked about explicitly. Is this right? Where when you look at a publication, you sort of analyze how much of a business it operates as,
Mhm.
and then that's sort of like part of your thinking process in terms of how you approach them. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a great thing to pull out of it. That's accurate. Yeah, I think there are people who want to actually make money from it, right? They need to make money. Maybe they're trying to pay a salary or something,
Hmm.
and so they need to make all the numbers match up. And then there's some people who are like, I am definitely going to lose money on this, and I'm going to probably put a couple $100s each year. I just hope the last book pays for the next book
Yeah.
almost. And that's how they see the enterprise. And usually it reflects like different qualities of books, and not qualities like high and low quality, but like things that are maybe more experimental or more like punk influence or DIY or something like that. But yeah, I think how much people need to make money really make money from that particular enterprise really influences the types of decisions that they make.
Yeah.
And for me, it's why I like the small press world a lot, is because there's a lot of spaces in which people have figured out other ways to make money, and they're doing this as a labor of love, as many of us are as writers, right? Like I'm
Hmm.
doing the writing thing as a labor of love, many of us are. And if we can make money, that's great, but we're often doing it because we want to just make something really great or really weird or really whatever. And when you can find somebody who's also exclusively interested in the work, right, and like doesn't have those financial concerns around it, it can be hard because like then it's harder to make it sustainable, and it's depending on the labor of that person. But at the same
Yeah.
time, it's really open space for work that is just truly transcendent.
Um, I have another question about submitting. Say someone has a book of like a manuscript of 80 to 90 poems. Would you recommend they first try to get some of them published as a chapbook before going into the full um, submitting the full manuscript, or how should they think about that?
Yeah, it's another great question. I think, as with some of my answers, I would recommend that you do what's going to feel good for you. I don't think having things published pre-existingly is necessarily going to give you a much better chance with a book contest. I think just seeing those publications like might influence some people when they're making decisions, but a lot of book contests or book reading periods are anonymous, so it doesn't really matter. But I do think the benefit of submitting to literary magazines first is, one, that they give you some milestones that you can set. So you can really polish a set of 5 poems, send them out, and it gives you kind of like a way of focusing on like a finite amount of work that you can really polish into being perfect.
Hmm.
And then also it allows you to kind of get feedback from the world about what's working best. Like, let's say you have 90 poems, that's amazing. And you can really cut that down if you need to, right? Like if you submit all of those and then certain ones are getting picked up and certain ones aren't, at least for me, that's a process that has resulted in cutting a lot of poems from my books. So if you see which ones really take, you might say, oh, like somebody loved these ones. They're going to be first in the book. You know, these ones never got accepted. Maybe I need to rethink them or not include them in the book. So it can be a way of getting feedback and just getting a little bit more information about how your thing is going to come across. So I think there's a lot of benefits for it, and it can just give you energy along the way because it takes forever to write a book, and it's really helpful to have some, little successes along the way to publishing one.
Um, one last question, if you have time for it. We had an author who was older, and they said, I just don't have time, like 7 or 8 years to get my work out there. Do you have any advice for people who in that sort of a situation?
Yeah, absolutely. Not every publishing process takes forever. There are venues that can be actually really quick. And if you sign on to a service like Duotrope, for example, they'll often give you response times and you can sort for shorter response times. And then you can select venues on the basis of that.
Mhm.
And small presses as well often have like a shorter turnaround time. Maybe, 1 or 2 years is still reasonable to expect for a full book, but I definitely empathize with that. I mean, you want your work to get published quickly, regardless of what situation you're in. You want it to reflect what you've been working on recently, and it's hard when it takes a really long time. I think the small press and lit mag world in particular is a little more nimble, a little more flexible. Weird, interesting stuff can happen really fast, and that's why I've
Yeah.
invested a lot of energy in that world. But I think start now and just focus on getting it out there, and the steps will begin.
Yeah, that really matches like my own experience and observations where if you're part of a community, you may know someone who runs a small press and that often, or maybe someone who is just looking for your type of writing, just building those connections or community, friends of friends, it can lead to opportunities that you wouldn't otherwise find.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it's sustaining you along the way too, in addition
Yeah.
to the opportunity to publish.
All right, so we're out of time, but Dennis, thank you so much for being here. And I want to thank everybody who attended today, and thank you for your time and your questions and your thoughts. Thank you also to everyone behind the scenes at Authors Publish who make these possible. Caitlin Jans, Emily Harstone, S. Calikar, everybody there. Um, and also, thank you to everybody who has supported Authors Publish throughout the years. And if you have any questions or feedback for me, you can always email support@authorspublish.com. I always enjoy hearing from you. And everybody, if you enjoyed this talk, please do look up How to Submit by Dennis James Sweeney and buy a copy of his book. We'll send a link to it along with the recording. And yeah, Dennis, is there anything else you would like to say?
Just delighted to speak with y'all today. And like I was saying, this feels like the thing, this feels like creating something together and creating community together. So really appreciate getting to be in community with y'all. And I'm sending you the best of luck for your writing and publishing.
Yeah. Dennis, thank you.